In 2006, at the height of the stock market, credit and housing bubbles blown up across the rich Western world, adverts began to appear stating what seemed to be an obvious truth. We live in financial times. And who could argue with the idea that stock markets, commodity markets and share prices, flows of capital between banks, corporations, hedge funds and individuals are what most decisively shape our era? But of course, the ads weren't just there to make sure people had got the point. They were cunningly designed to sell more copies of one of the world's leading papers. Published in London, the UK's great financial centre, the Financial Times is the daily bulletin for the people who own the world. Every day it brings news from around the globe onto the desks of its readers, keeping them up to date on all the developments that might affect the value of their investments, which means pretty much everything in this age of globalised finance. The paper was established just over 125 years ago in 1888, with a slogan claiming that it was a friend to the honest financier and respectable broker. In 1893, the FT began to be printed on its trademark salmon pink paper to distinguish it from its main rival at the time, a gimmick it has happily stuck to ever since. For most of the 20th century, it was very British in its readership base, though it always shared the global horizons of imperial power. 1979, the year Thatcher was elected, was a watershed year. A dispute with printers' unions in London provided the pretext for printing another edition of the paper in Frankfurt, continental Europe's main financial centre. This was, in retrospect, the start of the paper's globalization. More and more international sales meant that in 1997 it launched a US edition, following up with an Asian one in 2003. It also launched a German-language edition in 2000, but this didn't have much appeal beyond the elite sectors of German capital and shut down in 2012. Last year, the FT had a worldwide daily print readership of 1.5 million, with many more reading it online. Altogether, it claims a net audience of just over 2 million across the world, fairly evenly distributed between the UK, the US and Europe, with somewhat fewer readers in Asia, Africa and the Middle East. Who reads the Financial Times and why? The main thing that strikes you about the FT compared to any other paper is pretty basic. Everything is about money. To be sure, it has probably the best international news coverage of any British paper, and its staff of around 500 journalists is the largest of any paper in the world. Turn the pages on a given day and you'll reliably find high-quality reporting on every part of the globe, which is more than can be said for most news outlets. But politics knows its place. Here, finance is king. For starters, every day half the paper is devoted to companies and markets, so that readers can get the lowdown on the latest developments in the corporate world and then scour the columns of tiny figures on share prices. In the front section, meanwhile, the coverage of world news is heavily slanted towards economics and finance. Its stories focus on the state of markets, bond yields, profits and dividends from place to place. It's a paper for high-flying, hard-hitting entrepreneurs, as its publicity shots blending Richard Branson with Che Guevara suggest. Or this poster on mergers and acquisitions with its obvious implication that reading the FT will help your business to be the big shark rather than any of the smaller ones. It's not just about helping its readers make a pile of money, though. Every month, the FT also publishes a glossy magazine whose title is either a wry self-parody or just plain obnoxious. How to spend it. And to be fair, this is not a simple question. Who doesn't worry about what kind of yacht to buy? Whether vintage wines are a good investment? How many villas in Tuscany are too many? Is £600 enough to pay for a pair of sneakers, or should you really push the boat out and pay $1,400? In 2013, when the paper turned 125, its editor Lionel Barber smugly reproduced an anecdote to show why the paper was essential reading. A Chinese ambassador in Africa was apparently once asked why he was carrying a copy of the paper. "We always read the FT in the embassy," he replied, "because capitalists never lie." This is, of course, untrue in pretty much every way anyone could ever think of. They lie all the time. But they tell different lies when they're talking amongst themselves. And that's what you can see when you read the Financial Times. Take the op-ed pages, for example. Reading these is like being invited into the club lounge of the global elite. It regularly has contributions from world leaders like Barack Obama, Tony Blair, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang, former Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, from high functionaries of financial institutions such as Alan Greenspan, Dominic Strauss-Kahn and Robert Zerlich of the World Bank, from private financiers like George Soros and Warren Buffett, and from intellectuals such as Francis Fukuyama, Niall Ferguson, Bernard-Henri Lévy, Hernando de Soto, Jorge Castañeda, and Michael Ignatieff. Larry Summers has a gig as their economics commentator, and historian Simon Sharma floats around interviewing the great and the good, such as Henry Kissinger, Bill Clinton, or Israeli Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni. In short, the FT's pages are a place where the people who run the world can relax and talk amongst friends. What are the paper's priorities? Well, money, for starters. From that point of view, the FT is resolutely pragmatic. Unlike The Economist, for example, it's much more interested in stability and predictability than in ideological purity. Profits come before dogma. That's why the paper has not been quite as gung-ho as many other establishment outlets about the US-led wars in the Middle East. It supported the invasion of Afghanistan on anti-terrorist grounds, but was slightly cagier about Iraq. Too much bombing might not be so good for business. Still, FT magazine editor John Lloyd fervently supported the war in its pages and elsewhere, saying that the left had lost the plot and discredited itself in not supporting the invasion. In his view, invading Iraq was the courageous thing to do. In November 2006, Lloyd brimmed with sympathy for Tony Blair. He must hope, and so should we, that it will be recognized how much honor he did his country by ensuring the end of a monster. In a masterpiece of distorting understatement, Lloyd noted that it is true that there are real advances in Iraq in civil freedoms, but the chaos, mainly in the capital, offsets these. Of much more concern for the FT than tens of thousands of people being killed in Iraq, though, was the global financial crisis that arrived in 2007. Now, this really was a problem. Money was at stake. As Martin Wolf wrote in December of that year, what is happening in credit markets today is a huge blow to the credibility of the Anglo-Saxon model of financial capitalism. He described the credit crunch as a turning point for the world economy, which opened up huge questions about the banking system and its regulation, about the role of the dollar in the global financial architecture, and about the economic position of the US in the world. As Wolf put it in 2009, capitalism had careered over a cliff. On the political front, too, the earthquake on Wall Street seemed to mark a watershed. According to Gideon Rachman, 3 decades of globalization had been beneficial for everyone. In his view, things were steadily improving from the 1980s on, with the Thatcher boom, the election of Clinton, the fall of communism, the arrival of Tony Blair, the burst of economic growth in India. Who could ask for anything more? But this win-win setup had now been shattered. After the financial crisis, we suddenly found ourselves in what he called a zero-sum world, where China's gains were America's losses and vice versa, where US power was bogged down in endless wars in the Middle East, where austerity was biting into living standards across Europe. This must have been a rude awakening for the FT's main political commentator, so it seems almost cruel to point out that for most of the planet, the win-win era had been more of a lose-lose affair, so zero-sum might even be an improvement. And did it not occur to him that, just maybe, the surge of neoliberal triumphalism after 1989 paved the way for all the bleak developments he now found himself describing? The huge bank bailouts and market liquidity Western governments laid on certainly helped to ease the financial sector's pain, and by 2009 everyone had calmed down. Martin Wolf downgraded the crisis from a turning point to a moment, but maybe not a defining one. That year, the FT ran a series of articles debating the future of capitalism, inviting such luminaries as Joseph Stiglitz, the then German Foreign Secretary and sometime plagiarist Karl Theodor zu Guttenberg, and Brazil's President Lula to share their views. On the whole, they offered a soothing message. For example, Leszek Balcerowicz, chief implementer of shock therapy in Poland, reassured readers that dynamic entrepreneurial capitalism has nowadays no serious external enemies. It can only be weakened from within. And who would want to do that? This brings us to the FT's coverage of the one part of the world where progressive alternatives to neoliberal capitalism are being explored at all seriously. For the most part, the FT has opted for lofty disdain rather than the vitriolic attacks common in other publications, but every so often it hasn't been able to restrain itself. It was exultant when Hugo Chavez died. After Chavez, a chance for progress, crowed an editorial in March 2013, adding that his passing can only be helpful for the region. Another feature from the same week looked forward to regime change in Cuba. As Chavismo crumbles, so goes the last best hope for a Cuban experiment that failed long ago. Elsewhere in the region, it prophesied an end to the kind of irresponsible populism that had redistributed a fraction of national income towards the poor. Now, it argued, there were signs of a welcome return to economic rationality. In an editorial from April this year, for example, it smugly noted that Latin America's rebels had turned to pragmatism. For the past few years, it said with exasperation, Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela had reheated just about every piece of anti-imperialist rhetoric they could dig up from the 1970s to roar against the overweening West and the impersonal forces of neoliberalism. Now they were starting to see common sense. Argentina devalued, Ecuador returned to the bond markets, Venezuela partially liberalized currency controls. As the FT saw it, Latin America's bad boys are starting to put their economies in order, it seems. In mid-June, it had even more encouraging news from Venezuela. After years of struggle and uncertainty and exile, polo could now once again be played in the country. Things are definitely moving in the right direction as far as the FT is concerned. Europe has been another source of great concern for the paper. Not so much the mass unemployment and suffering caused by the economic crisis and government austerity measures, as the prospect of a splintering of the Eurozone. especially if the complex chains of debt obligations were to unravel in the event of a sovereign default in, say, Greece. In 2010, 2011 and 2012, its op-ed pages buzzed with plans to save Greece or kick it out, to partition the Eurozone or disband it. But in the end, the hard, sado-monetarist line of Angela Merkel prevailed and calm returned. Before the FT's German language edition closed down in 2012, it tried to perform one last vital service for the German banks, publishing an appeal in Greek before the elections in that country, urging the populace to resist the demagogue. It claimed that if they voted for Syriza, the left anti-austerity party, whose leader Alexis Tsipras stressed his affinities with Chavez, the country would collapse. The scaremongering backfired, with Syriza losing by only a narrow margin, and it was the FT Deutschland that got made redundant, closing down at the end of the year without ever posting a profit. The FT's panic over a possible left victory in Greece is just one of a number of lathers the paper has got into, which seem to be cyclical. In part, this is a reflection of its umbilical connection to the stock market. It panics when they do, it jumps when they do. Perhaps this symbiotic relationship to finance, and to the City of London in particular, explains the curious fantasy landscape in its 2006 advert. I initially thought this was just a mild exaggeration of the view from the FT's own offices in London, where its staff can look out across the River Thames at the city's beating financial heart. But looking at it more closely, you can see that the knot of towers clustered on this island is actually a composite of all the world's financial districts and market metropolises. There are landmarks here from London, Hong Kong, Shanghai, New York, Kuala Lumpur, Beijing. All the world's skyscrapers and moneymakers, in other words, are gathered here on this fantasy island, and there's nothing around them but water. There are no factories or farms or workshops or schools or hospitals, and no one who works in them, let alone any poor or unemployed people. This is the FT's dream world, and it's a world cleansed of anything but finance. The slogan across the top reads, "We live in financial times," but what the ad really says, and what the paper's content really conveys, is a different message. We live in financial paradise, and screw the rest of you.